It started with a small finger. A child's finger, 5 years old, small enough to fit in the space between the letters of the tattoo she was pointing at, touching the ink the way children touch things they recognize from somewhere they cannot immediately place. She was sitting in the booth across the aisle from the large man, and she had been watching him for 5 minutes with the unguarded attention that small children bring to everything that interests them, and what interested her was the eagle on the inside of his left forearm, the specific eagle, wings spread, head turned left, the stars arranged in a particular way around the base, because she had seen that eagle before. She had traced it with her finger the way she was tracing this one now. The large man felt the touch and looked down. The girl was leaning across the aisle of the Canby Road diner with her small arm extended, her finger on his forearm, looking at the tattoo with the expression of a child in the presence of something they know is significant. Before they understand why it is significant, she said, "My daddy had that exact one." The large man went still. Not startled still. Not uncomfortable still. The specific stillness of a man receiving information that has arranged itself into a shape he is not yet ready to name. He said, very quietly, "What did you say?" She said it again, the way children repeat things they have been asked to repeat, not sensing the weight, just supplying the words, "My daddy had that exact one." Right there. Her finger moved to the stars at the base. Even these. The man looked at his arm. He looked at the girl. He looked at her face, at the specific quality of a child's face in the moment when they have said something true and are waiting to see what the truth produces. He looked at her for a long moment. What happened after that would take the rest of the afternoon. And when it was over, a little girl in Canby, Oregon, would understand something about her father that she had been too young to be told. And 22 men would be parked in the lot of a roadside diner because one of them had made a phone call and said 6 words that were all it took. He had a daughter. She's here. The Canby Road diner had been sitting at the junction of Route 99E and Canby Road since 1954. Which made it the oldest continuously operating business in Clackamas County that had not changed hands more than twice, and which gave it the particular quality of a place that has been in a community long enough to be part of its connective tissue, not famous, not charming in a self-conscious way, just persistently present in the way of things that have survived by being genuinely useful. The sign outside was a wooden one, hand-lettered in 1954, and re-lettered in 1978, and not substantially altered since. And it said simply Canby Road Diner in the no-nonsense way of an establishment that had not needed to advertise for 40 years. Inside, the booths were original, maple, solid, the kind of furniture that outlasts the people who chose it. The counter ran the length of the back wall and had 12 stools, and was covered in the same material it had been covered in since 1982, which was a vinyl the color of old cream that had been wiped down enough times that it had a translucence in places, as though you could almost see through to the laminate beneath. The coffee was the kind of coffee that a person accustomed to the pour-over varieties available in Portland would describe as basic, and that a long-haul trucker coming in off Route 99E after 11 hours behind a wheel would describe as the reason they were still driving. The morning smelled of bacon fat and fresh bread from the kitchen, and the pine scented cleaner that the owner, a woman named Pat Sato, used on the floors every morning before opening. It was a Thursday in March. The sky outside was the particular Oregon gray that is not a weather event, but a condition. Low, soft, permanent from November through April. The sky that Pacific Northwesterners stopped noticing somewhere around their 4th winter. The parking lot held 8 vehicles and 1 motorcycle. Mitch Delaney had been on that motorcycle since 7 this morning. coming up from Salem, where he had spent 2 days on chapter business that required his physical presence and not his preferred method of operation, which was the phone. He was 46 years old, 5'10", 187 pounds, which was the weight of a man who was lean in the specific way of people who do physical work and eat when they're hungry and don't spend any mental energy on the subject beyond that. He had a dark beard going gray at the chin and forearms that were mapped with ink from his left wrist to his elbow. Not chaotic, not decorative for decoration's sake, but the specific accumulation of a man who had been marking things on his body for 20 years in the way that some people mark them on paper. The eagle on his left forearm he had gotten in 2021. It was the last tattoo he had added, and he had gotten it at a shop in Salem 3 months after a chapter brother named Garrett Oakes had been killed on I-5 in October of 2020. When a truck came into his lane on a wet night south of Woodburn, and Garrett had not had enough road to make the choice that would have saved him. The eagle was Garrett's design. Garrett had drawn it himself on a piece of graph paper in 2018 and had it put on his forearm, and had told Mitch, sitting in the shop while it was being done, that he was going to get everyone in the chapter to match it eventually. He had gotten 2 takers before October 2020. Mitch had been the first. A man named Ray Duggan had been the second, a week before the accident. After October 2020, 6 more had gotten it. Mitch had been the chapter's road captain for 4 years, and its secretary before that, and before that, a member who had been here long enough to have ridden with men who were gone now, and who he carried the way you carry people who have gone ahead. Not as grief exactly, not anymore, but as a kind of permanent inventory, a set of names that he kept updated and accurate, and that he did not discuss with people who had not known them. He had ordered coffee and eggs and was reading the menu's back panel, which listed the diner's specials in handwriting that had been the same person's handwriting since 1991, and which he read not because he was going to order a special, but because reading something gave him permission to sit without the obligation of social performance. When the woman and the child slid into the booth across the aisle, he had not looked up. He had not needed to. He had noted them in the way he noted things: registration without attention, the ambient data of a room, and had gone back to the specials. He had been reading about the Thursday pot roast when the small finger touched his arm. Before we find out who that little girl's daddy was, if you're new here, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. City, state, anywhere in the world. I read every one. Now, back to the Canby Road Diner. Because the woman in that booth across the aisle had not known what her daughter was about to do, and what her daughter was about to produce was the one conversation she had been both dreading and needing for 2 years. Her name was Laurel Oakes. She was 31 years old. She had been a widow since she was 29, which meant she had been a widow for 2 years and 3 months, and she had been doing the arithmetic of that duration in the back of her mind every day since October 2020, the way people do arithmetic when the numbers mark something they cannot stop marking. Garrett Oakes had been 28 when he died. He and Laurel had been together since she was 23. She had met him at a mutual friend's birthday party in Salem. A party she had almost not gone to because she had a headache, and the drive was long, and she had gone because the friend had called twice, and she had felt guilty about the almost not going, and Garrett had been the one who found the headache medication in his truck's glove compartment when she mentioned it in passing, and she had looked at this large man rummaging through his glove compartment for ibuprofen, for a woman he had known for 11 minutes, and she had thought, this is a specific kind of person. She had been right. They had been married for 2 years when Nora was born. Garrett had been present for the birth. present in the full sense of a man who had decided that being present for things was not optional, who had taken the classes and read the book, and who had held Laurel's hand with the particular grip of a man who is frightened and is not going to show it because she needed the grip more than she needed to see his fear. He had cried when Nora was born. He had cried in the way that men cry when they have been keeping something very carefully and the keeping is suddenly no longer required, and the sound of it had been, in Laurel's memory, the most honest sound she had ever heard from another person. Nora was 3 when Garrett died. She was 5 now. She was in kindergarten at Canby Elementary, and she had her father's eyes. The specific dark brown that went almost black in certain lights, and his habit of tilting her head slightly when she was thinking about something, and his complete indifference to the social cost of saying exactly what she observed, which was a quality that had been charming in Garrett and was charming in Nora, and which Laurel was going to have to address before middle school, but was not going to address yet. Nora's revealing small detail. She kept, in the small zippered pocket of every jacket she owned, a photograph of herself and her father from a day at the Clackamas County Fair in September 2020, 1 month before he died. In the photograph, Garrett was carrying her on his shoulders, and she was holding his head with both hands. And both of them were laughing at something outside the frame, and neither of them knew it was the last county fair. Laurel had put the photograph in Nora's first jacket pocket when Nora was 4 and old enough to understand what photographs were, and Nora had moved it from pocket to pocket ever since, in the specific, careful way of a child who has been given a responsibility they take seriously. Laurel had not taken Nora to the chapter after Garrett died. She had intended to. Garrett's chapter brothers had been at the service and had been at the house afterward, and had been present in the ways they knew to be present. And she had been grateful, and she had told herself that she would bring Nora to them when Nora was old enough to understand. But 2 years had passed, and the visits had not happened, and in the space of not happening they had grown into something that felt harder to initiate. Not because anyone had withdrawn, but because Laurel was not sure, still, what to do with the part of Garrett that had belonged to the chapter, which was a large part, one she had loved, but had not always fully understood. The morning had not been planned for revelation. She had been in Canby for a doctor's appointment, Nora's 6-month checkup, routine. The pediatrician on Baker Street, who had been Nora's doctor since birth, and the diner was on the way back to the highway, and Nora had asked for pancakes, and Laurel had said yes, because saying yes to pancakes was the kind of uncomplicated thing a morning could produce, and she had wanted an uncomplicated thing. After 2 weeks that had not been. She had not noticed the man in the adjacent booth until Nora was out of her seat. She turned and saw her daughter's arm extended across the aisle and her finger on a stranger's forearm, and she opened her mouth to say, "Nora, come back here," and then she saw the tattoo. She saw it before she heard what Nora said. She saw the eagle, the wings, the head turned left, the stars at the base, and the word she had been about to say did not come out. She had traced that eagle herself. Late at night, when Garrett had been asleep, and she had been awake the way she was sometimes awake, running her finger along the lines of it in the dark, feeling the raised edges of old ink. She knew the specific way it sat on the inside of the forearm. She knew the curve of the wings and the arrangement of the stars, and the slight thickening at the base where the needle had gone over twice. She heard Nora say, "My daddy had that exact one." She heard the man go still. She heard him ask Nora to say it again. She heard Nora say it again, with the finger on the stars, even these. She was already sliding out of the booth. She came to the edge of the aisle and she stood there, and she looked at the man, at his face, at the stillness of him, at the specific quality of someone who has received information that is rearranging the room, And she said, "I'm sorry. She saw your tattoo." He looked up at her. He looked at her face. He said, "What was your husband's name?" Her throat tightened. She said, "Garrett Oakes." The man looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, not grief. It was past grief. It was the thing that lives on the other side of grief, when the name of someone you loved is said aloud by someone who also loved them. He said, "Sit down." She said, He said, "Please, sit down." She sat down. Nora climbed into the booth beside her, satisfied that the exchange had been resolved, and picked up the children's menu to look at the pictures. The man said, "My name is Mitch Delaney. I was Garrett's road captain for 2 years." He paused. "I was with him the night he died." Laurel went still. She had been told about the accident in fragments, the road, the truck, the Woodburn exit, the rain. She had not been told about the night in detail because the people who had the details had made a collective and unspoken decision that she did not need them in those first weeks. And the weeks had become months, and the months had become 2 years, and nobody had offered, and she had not asked, because not asking felt safer than whatever the asking would produce. She said, "You were there." He said, "I was 2 vehicles behind him. I was the first one to stop." The diner was quiet around them. Pat Sato was at the far end of the counter. The other customers, 3 of them, truckers, eating without looking up, continued their breakfasts. Laurel looked at her hands. She said, "He never told me everyone who had gotten that tattoo." Mitch said, "There are 8 of us now." She said, "He told me he was going to get the whole chapter to match it." Mitch said, "He was working on it." Something crossed her face, the particular quality of a smile that is not happy exactly, but is the recognition of a person. The flash of who someone was before the loss made the was the operative tense. She said, "That sounds like him." Mitch said, "Yeah, Nora," who had been examining the children's menu with the focused attention she brought to anything with pictures, looked up at Mitch and said, "Did you know my daddy?" Mitch looked at her. He said, "I rode with him." She said, "On a motorcycle?" He said, "Yes, she thought about this." She said, "He told me he'd teach me when I was big enough." He looked at her. He said, "How big are you?" She considered the question seriously. She said, 5. He said, "You've got some time then." She said, "That's what Mama says." She went back to the menu. Laurel was watching this exchange with the expression of a person watching something that costs them something and gives them something at the same time. The specific compound quality of a moment that is simultaneously painful and necessary and unexpected and right. She said, "I was going to bring her to the chapter." After, she stopped. She said, "I kept meaning to." Mitch said, "We kept meaning to call." She said, "Why didn't you?" He said, "We didn't want to intrude. We figured you'd reach out when you were ready." She said, "I figured the same thing about you." They looked at each other. 2 people who had been waiting for the other to go first and had, through the specific arithmetic of grief and politeness, created a 2-year gap that a 5-year-old had just bridged with 1 finger. Mitch said, "I have his phone in my saddlebag." She went still. She said, "What?" He said, "Garrett's phone. It was in his jacket when I pulled over. I've been meaning to get it to you." He paused. For 2 years. She could not speak for a moment. She looked at the table. She said, "It's still." He said, "It's off. It's in a case. I don't know what's on it." He paused. I didn't look. She said, "You've been carrying it for 2 years." He said, "I've been riding the same route. I kept thinking I'd stop." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them was the specific understanding of two people who have been doing the same irrational thing for the same reason. Holding something because letting go of it feels like the second loss. And the second loss is the one you are not sure you survive. She said, "Can I have it?" He said, "That's why I stopped today." He had not known she would be here. He had not planned to stop at the Canby Road Diner specifically. He had stopped because he was hungry, and it was the first place after Canby, and the Thursday pot roast on the specials menu was something he had been eating here since 2017. He had not known. But Garrett's phone had been in his saddlebag for 2 years, and something had made him not leave it in Salem this trip, and not leave it in the lockbox at the chapter house, and not mail it. And that something had no name that Mitch could give it, but it produced this morning. This diner, this booth, and a small girl who had reached across an aisle and put her finger on an eagle. He said, "I'll get it." He brought it in from the saddlebag in its case, a black rubber case, scuffed at the corners from 2 years in a saddlebag, but intact. He set it on the table in front of Laurel. She looked at it. She put her hand on it. She did not pick it up. She just put her hand on it, the way you put your hand on a door before you open it. Nora looked at the phone. She said, "Is that Daddy's?" Laurel said, "Yes." Nora said, "Can I see it?" Laurel said, "Not yet, baby." Nora accepted this with the equanimity of a child who understands that some things require waiting, and who has been given enough honest answers in her 5 years not to push on the ones that come with a particular quality of weight. She went back to the menu. Pat Sato brought the pancakes. She set them down without ceremony and went back to the counter. The pancakes were the ones Nora had ordered, blueberry with butter, the way Nora had asked for them, and the arrival of them produced in Nora the shift of attention that food produces in 5-year-olds, which is total and immediate and complete. Mitch watched Nora eat her pancakes. He said, "She has his eyes." Laurel said, "Everyone says so." He said, "And the head tilt." She said, "God, I know." He said, "He used to do that before he said something he thought was important, like he was lining it up." She said, "He did it the night he proposed." I almost laughed. Mitch said, "Did you tell him that?" She said, "Eventually." He said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said he knew. He said the head tilt was the thing he did when he was nervous, and I was the only person who had ever made him nervous." Mitch looked at the table. He said, "That sounds right." She said, "Did he ever tell you about the night we met?" He said, "The headache." She stopped. She said, "He told you about the headache?" Mitch said, "He told everybody about the headache. He told it every time someone asked how you met." He said he found ibuprofen in his glove compartment and gave it to a woman he'd known for 11 minutes, and she looked at him like he had done something remarkable. She looked at the table. She said, "He had done something remarkable." Mitch said, "He knew that." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "He used to say that being there for the small things was how you showed up for the large ones, like it was a practice." Mitch said, "He said that to me too. When I was road captain, and I was trying to figure out what the job actually was." He paused. He said it wasn't about the big moments. It was about being there consistently enough that when the big moment arrived, being there was already the habit. Laurel looked at him. She said, "That's..." She stopped. She said, "I've been trying to remember things he said. I write them down when I remember them. I'm afraid I'm going to forget." He said, "You won't forget." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because you remember the headache. You're going to remember everything." He called the chapter at 11:15. Not from the table. He stepped outside. into the gray Oregon morning and stood in the parking lot and called Roy Hennessy, the chapter president, and said 6 words. He had a daughter. She's here. Roy said, "Where?" Mitch said, "Canby Road Diner. Route 99E. Roy said, "Give me an hour." Mitch said, "She's not expecting." Roy said, "She doesn't have to expect it." He came back inside and sat down and ordered the Thursday pot roast and told Laurel that some people might stop by and asked if that was all right. She looked at him. She said, "How many people?" He said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Mitch." He said, "However many can make it." She looked at Nora, who had finished her pancakes and was now drawing something on the back of the children's menu with the crayon Pat Sato had left. She looked at the phone on the table under her hand. She said, "Okay." Engines. The first sound came at 12:19 from the direction of Route 99E, low, building, the sound of a single engine becoming the sound of more than one, and then the sound of more than that. Pat Sato heard it from behind the counter and looked at the window. The trucker on the end stool heard it and looked up from his coffee. Nora heard it and looked up from her drawing. She said, "What's that?" Mitch said, "Friends." She said, "Whose friends?" He said, "Yours." She looked at him. She said, "Mine?" He said, "Your daddy's." Same thing. The lot filled in the specific, unhurried way of a formation that knows where it is going. Not fast, not dramatic, but with the deliberate coherence of 22 motorcycles that had come from 4 different directions in the preceding 45 minutes and arrived at the same place at the same time, because the same 6 words had reached all of them, and all of them had understood. 22 motorcycles. 22 engines cutting in sequence, until the last one went quiet, and the parking lot of the Canby Road Diner held chrome and leather, and 22 men in the gray Oregon noon. They were silent when they stopped. They did not come inside immediately. They stood beside their bikes in the quiet lot, and they waited. In the way of people who understand that the next move is not theirs to make, that they have arrived and the arriving is sufficient, and the rest will come from inside. Roy Hennessy came through the door first. He was 53 years old and had been riding longer than Mitch had been riding and had known Garrett Oakes for 9 years, and he walked to the booth with the specific directness of a man who does not need to warm up to a situation. He looked at Laurel. He looked at Nora. He said, "I'm Roy. I was your father's chapter president." Nora said, "He rode with my daddy." Roy looked at her. Something moved in his face, the movement that happens when a child says a true thing plainly. He said, "Yeah, I did." She said, "He had the same tattoo." Roy looked at Mitch. Mitch said nothing. Roy said to Nora, "We all got it. Because your daddy drew it." She said, "He drew it?" Roy said, "On graph paper. He was very particular about the stars." She looked at Mitch's forearm. She looked at the stars at the base of the eagle. She reached out and touched them again, the same motion she had made 2 hours ago, the finger on the ink. She said, "He showed it to me once. The drawing." The booth went very quiet. Laurel was looking at her daughter. She was looking at a 5-year-old girl who had been 3 when her father died, and who had remembered a piece of graph paper with a drawing on it, who had carried the memory the way she carried the photograph, carefully, in the small pocket, taken out and checked on in private. Roy said, "Do you still have it? The drawing?" Laurel said, "I don't know." She paused. "Maybe, in his things." Roy said, "If you find it, we'd like to see it." He paused. "If that's all right." She said, "Yes, The door opened again. More men came in. They came in ones and twos, and they filled the back booths and the counter stools, and they ordered coffee from Pat Sato, who produced it from both pots simultaneously, and did not ask questions, and refilled without being asked. Because Pat Sato had owned the Canby Road Diner for 21 years, and she understood what kind of morning this was. Nora watched them come in. She watched each one the way she watched the first one, with the specific attention of a child cataloging new information. And she noticed, one by one, what each of them had on their forearms. Not all of them. 7 of them. 7 eagles on 7 forearms, and she looked at each one with the recognition that she had felt when she first touched Mitch's arm, the feeling of seeing something she knew from somewhere she could not quite place, the feeling of the county fair photograph in her pocket. She said to Mitch, "They all have it," he said. "The ones who got it after." She said, "After what?" He looked at Laurel. Laurel looked at her daughter. She said, "After Daddy died, honey. They got it so they could carry him with them." Nora looked at this information. She looked at the 7 eagles around the diner. She was 5 years old, and she was processing at the speed of a child who has been given something true and is deciding where to put it. She said, "So, he's with them." Laurel said, "Yes." She said, "On their arms." Laurel said, "Yes." Nora looked at Mitch's forearm. She looked at the eagle. She put her finger on it one more time, not exploring this time, not trying to place it, just touching it the way you touch something you have made a decision about. She said, "Good." The chapter stayed for 2 hours. They ate. They drank Pat Sato's coffee. They told Laurel stories about Garrett, not the large ones. Not the ones about the accident or the years or the things that required context she might not have, but the small ones, the Tuesday afternoon variety, the kind that accumulate into the texture of a person across years of regular proximity. The time he fixed a prospect's bike in the rain on the side of Route 99 and then made the prospect buy him lunch. Because that was the correct transaction, and the prospect needed to understand that favors have a value even when they are freely given. The time he brought homemade tamales to a December gathering because his neighbor Mrs. Flores had given him too many, and he was not going to eat 40 tamales alone, and he expected everyone to address this situation. The way he laughed, which was a laugh that started low and built and arrived at a volume that was, by any objective measure, too much for most situations, and which was, for that reason, the laugh you could pick out in a full restaurant from the parking lot. Laurel laughed at the tamale story in the way she had not laughed in 2 years, the full version, not the managed version she had been deploying in social situations, because the managed version protected both her and the people around her from the rawness of the real one. She laughed, and it ran its full course, and she put her hand over her mouth when it was done, and looked at the table, and said, "Sorry," Mitch said. "Don't be." She said, "I'd forgotten what that felt like." A man named Cal, who had been sitting at the counter and who had not said much, said he would have laughed twice as hard. She said, "I know." She did. Before they left, Roy took an envelope from his jacket and set it on the table. He said, "We've been holding this. Chapter voted on it after he died." He paused. "It should have gotten to you sooner. We didn't know how." She looked at the envelope. She said, "What is it?" He said, "Open it later. It's for Nora." She put it in her bag. She walked outside with them and stood in the parking lot as they mounted up, one by one, and started their engines, and the sound of 22 V-twins filled the gray Oregon noon with a particular full-frequency sound that is not just heard, but felt. The kind that occupies the chest and the sinuses, and the back of the throat. Nora was on Laurel's hip, which was where she went when she was tired or overwhelmed, and she watched the formation with both arms around her mother's neck and her face turned toward the lot. Mitch was the last to mount. He looked at Laurel. He said, "I'll bring the phone charger. See if it's still," she said. "It's okay. I've got one." He said, "Okay." He started the Road King. He looked at Nora. She said, "Will you come back?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Promise?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." He pulled out of the lot. The formation gathered and moved toward Route 99E, 22 engines in the gray morning, and Laurel stood in the Canby Road diner parking lot with her daughter on her hip and watched them until the last one turned onto the highway and the sound of them thinned and dissolved into the ordinary ambient sound of a Thursday in Clackamas County. She stood there for another moment. She was thinking about the envelope in her bag, which she would open that evening at the kitchen table after Nora was in bed. Inside it was a letter on chapter stationery and a cashier's check made out to Nora Oakes for a sum that the chapter had been contributing to monthly since November 2020. 30 months of dues and donations, held until someone worked up the right way to get it to her, which had turned out not to be a letter or a visit, but a 5-year-old girl in a diner who recognized a drawing her father had made on graph paper because she had been 3 years old when he showed it to her, and she had remembered. She was thinking about the phone in her bag. She was thinking about what might be on it, the texts, the photographs. The last voicemail he had left her on a Tuesday afternoon in September, which she still had on her own phone, but had not been able to listen to since the week after the accident, which she was going to listen to again. Now. Because she was ready. She was thinking about Nora's finger on the tattoo, about the specific movement of a child reaching across an aisle toward something she recognized. She looked down at her daughter. Nora said, "Mama." She said, "Yeah." Nora said, "He's on their arms." Laurel said, "Yes." Nora said, "So, when they ride, he rides." Laurel looked at her 5-year-old daughter. She looked at this child who had her father's eyes and his head tilt, and his complete indifference to the social cost of saying exactly what she observed. She said, "Yes." Nora said, "Good." She put her head down on her mother's shoulder. Laurel held her. The parking lot was empty. The gray sky was still. From somewhere down Route 99E, receding south, the last echo of 22 engines faded into the ordinary Thursday sounds of Canby, Oregon. And then those sounds were just the sounds of the town, the traffic on the highway, the wind in the Douglas firs along the service road, the distant bell of the crossing signal 2 blocks east. She stood in that sound for a long time. Then she went inside to pay for the pancakes. There is a child in Canby, Oregon, who is going to grow up knowing that her father drew an eagle on graph paper and was very particular about the stars, that 22 men who loved him carried it on their arms into every road and every season afterward, that a small finger on a stranger's forearm one Thursday morning in March was not an accident, that her father is not gone in the way she was afraid he was gone. He rides. Every time they do, he rides. If this story reached you, if you know someone who is carrying a loss they think nobody else remembers, share it with them. Tell them they are not the only ones carrying it. Hit like, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment. Is there someone you carry? Do you have a way of carrying them? Type Garrett in the comments if this one reached all the way in.